Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. With the Bad Batch series coming out in just a few days, we're finally going to get a glimpse of what life was like for the clones during the transition from the Republic to the Empire. At first, not many things changed. The Republic military gets an overhaul that's mostly cosmetic. I mean, sure, the Clone Wars is officially over because Darth Vader headed over to Mustafar and Jedi younglinged all of the remaining leaders in the High Separatist Council. Also, their head of state, Dooku, had lost his head during the Battle of Coruscant, and the heart of the droid army, General Grievous, had his heart exploded during the Battle of Utapu. And while it was very clear to most individuals in the Republic and even in the Confederacy that the war and all major fighting was over, the reality was quite different. There were still plenty of Separatist holdouts willing to fight to the bitter end against the Empire. Even if it was just a small percentage of the original CIS that continues to fight, the Empire would still need to carry out pacification missions for several more years. The Umbarans, for instance, would never give up fighting against foreign oppressors. They were xenophobic and hated outsiders. The Yonderanian resistance under the command of extremist Saw Gerrera had just fought an entire civil war against the Separatists and were now equally prepared to take on the Empire. The Ryloth resistance traded in Wat Tambor and his droids for their new Imperial oppressors and their stormtroopers, and became the Free Ryloth movement. Even though the new soldiers of the Empire were called stormtroopers, beneath those very familiar helmets were just clone troopers. Emperor Palpatine had just used these same clone troopers to destroy the Jedi using Order 66. The clone army proved to be very successful and efficient at wiping out the Jedi, and that probably terrified Emperor Palpatine in some ways because he knows that those same contingency orders that he used against the Jedi could be used against him. For instance, there was Order 65, which stated, in the event of either a majority in the Senate declaring the Supreme Commander to be unfit to issue orders, or the Security Council declaring him to be unfit to issue orders, and an authenticated order being received by GAR, Commander shall be authorized to detain the Supreme Commander with lethal force if necessary. And command of the GAR shall fall to the acting Chancellor until a successor is appointed or alternative authority identified as outlined in Section 6. Order 4 and Order 5 and several other contingency orders also targeted Palpatine. And even though these orders were from the Republic era, there was still a chance that they could be used against Palpatine if someone found out about them. And so, ironically, the very contingency plans that helped the Sith Grand Plan reach its triumphant victory was also Darth Sidious's greatest fear. But in my opinion, this was just one of many reasons why Palpatine wanted to end the clone program. There are many other very obvious and more practical reasons why the clone army could no longer exist. For one, it was extremely expensive to train and maintain this military force. I mean, most military forces use civilians, either as conscripts or volunteers. A clone army needs to be genetically modified and then born in labs and raised until adulthood. Sure, the clone army was genetically enhanced to age at twice the rate of a normal human being, but it still took around 9 to 10 years to fully train a clone. This means feeding, sheltering, nurturing, teaching, and training a human being for almost a decade, which, as any parent should know, is a very extremely and time-consuming project. Even if you were able to consolidate the raising of clones like the Kaminoans did on Tipica City, the overall cost for this program must have been insane. We're talking about a few million credits for creating, training, and keeping just one single clone operational on the battlefield. And as elite as the clone army was, it was never really built on a sustainable economic model. This is why Palpatine eventually had to nationalize the banks. There just wasn't enough tax revenue being collected to sustain the growth of such a military. Plus, the clone army was built for an offensive war against a very tough enemy. I mean, these were elite shock troopers designed to be ferried from one system to another to bolster the regional militias and personal defense forces that already existed in the galaxy. I mean, just because the Ruusan Reformation removed the federal military didn't mean that regional security forces still existed. Clone troopers had very high morale. They were heavily armed and trained to take enemy positions. They often fought in mechanized units or utilized combined arms tactics. They were the best of the best, and perhaps overkill if deployed in large numbers during peacetime. So when the Separatist Alliance collapsed and all the Galactic Empire faced were small resistance movements using guerrilla tactics, the needs for the military changed as well. What the Galactic Empire now wanted was a massive military force that focused more on quantity rather than quality. What they needed were Imperial Army troopers and Imperial Navy troopers that could be garrisoned across the galaxy to project stability and strength. A soldier who fights behind a fortification and is only expected to defend requires far less resources. It's also far cheaper to just accept volunteers or conscript civilians into your military force. For one, their entire childhood and early education are subsidized by the parents and the education system. It's far less costly. Basic training for most military forces lasts only a few months, not almost a decade. Specialization takes more time, of course, but it's still significantly less time and cost than it takes to train a basic clone. Also, with the entire galaxy basically in shambles because of 4 years of devastating combat, supply chains were destroyed, infrastructures were dismantled, and local economies were ruined. And so there were plenty of people willing to sign up for the Imperial military, even though the pay and benefits by core world standards were not so great. Now, everything we mentioned so far definitely played a part in helping Palpatine decide to not use the clone army anymore, but I think the main reason why Palpatine actually bans the clone army is a loyalty issue. Kaminoans are essentially marine mammals. They probably are a few evolutionary steps ahead of dolphins and were known for being deceiving and untrustworthy. Their world had been inundated by great floods, and so they were forced to cull the weakest members of their own population in order to survive. As a species, they became obsessed with eugenics. This is where they developed a ruthless understanding of genetics and cloning. Now, in the cloning world, there were several different vendors and brands of different qualities and levels. The Kaminoans, like Apple, were extremely good at creating a brand that featured minimalistic, clean, and cool-looking designs that give the consumer confidence. And while their products were definitely high level compared to a lot of the competition, they didn't exactly deliver everything they promised on. Kind of like Apple? The Kaminoans promised the Republic the most obedient soldiers ever created. These clones were supposed to be loyal until the end, even if you didn't treat them very well. But the truth was, the more you suppressed the humanity and individuality of a clone, the poorer fighters they became. What the Kaminoans quickly realized were units who had a lot of individuality, like the Null Arcs or the Clone Commandos, were actually a lot more efficient and deadly on the battlefield. If you make the average clone trooper completely obedient, then they'll most likely fight just like a B-1 battle droid, which is of course not what you want. And so when the clone troopers were shipped out for Geonosis, they might have been brainwashed and conditioned to love the GAR and their Jedi commanders, but eventually the clones were all smart enough to kind of understand their situation. It wasn't great. Many clones would defect after the first battle of Geonosis when given the opportunity. Individuals like Cut LaQuain quickly realized that he didn't have a taste for killing and war. Then you had Sergeant Slick, who also grew disillusioned about the GAR and betrayed them to the Separatists. The clone commandos, who suffered 50% casualties during the Battle of Geonosis, also quickly realized how messed up their situation was, and with the help of their Mandalorian trainers, began developing backup plans should the whole clone army thing fall apart. This was really a no-brainer, and the Kaminoans should have known that they couldn't really promise the clones would be 100% loyal. That makes no sense. These clones were extremely intelligent individuals capable of flying advanced starfighters and coordinating massive invasions that required very complex logistical networks. When the clones started seeing how they were being treated by their Jedi commanders and how they were being used as cannon fodder, they naturally became disillusioned with their mission. When they saw how the average Republic citizen was able to live freely on Coruscant or many of the other populated worlds in the core, they also grew more disillusioned. Sure, most clones still bought into the whole Save the Republic propaganda, but with each passing year of the war, the clones became more individualistic and more restless. I mean, look at the 501st during the Battle of Umbara. How different are these men from a normal military? Look at how different each clone looks. Look at their hairstyles. Look at how they've painted their armor, gotten tattoos and other marks. It was clear that the clones had other interests besides just fighting a war. There's also that very uneasy question that a lot of clones probably thought about. Well, what would happen to them after the war was over? Would they get to retire? I mean, they didn't have any skills that could be useful in the private sector. Would they just be turned into protein paste? When General Ponkrell takes over the 501st on Umbara, he gives several terrible orders exposing the men to unnecessary casualties. But he actually has every right to do so because he is their commanding officer. But the clones of the 501st are very vocal about their disapproval of these orders. They even have a debate with Captain Rex about it. Some clones, like Jesse, Hardcase, and Fives, even directly disobey an order and carry out their own attack without any kind of authority from Central Command. The clones basically do everything short of carrying out a mutiny against Ponkrell, well, at first. This means they aren't really all that different from a normal human military unit. They don't seem blindly loyal or obedient. Finally, when Order 66 is executed, the clones who realize what's happened feel extremely violated. They had no idea these chips existed in their heads, and the thought of their creators implanting these control chips inside of their brains probably freaked many of them out. This would just be one of many grievances the clones would have with the Galactic Republic and Empire. And although some clones still stay loyal to the Empire and do remain docile and obedient, in the long run, the clone army was already very contaminated. In Palpatine's point of view, it no longer could be trusted as a fighting force and had become a liability. It was loyal to the Republic, a different government with a different set of principles. The Empire would be colder, more impersonal and ruthless. There would be no more nicknames, just serial numbers, no more colorful armor, just plain white. The clones had become too human, and it made the Empire, which wanted robotic servants, very uncomfortable. Ultimately, the GAR was creating an emergency situation, and so the Republic never properly built up, rules and regulations to treat these individuals fairly, and so the clone army was never really a sustainable long-term military force. After a few more years of fighting in the Clone Wars, they most likely would have just rebelled against the Republic and demanded better treatment. So, that's why I think Palpatine was going to get rid of them anyway. This was all according to his design. Let me know in the comment section below what you think, though. What is Palpatine's motivation for removing the clone army and replacing it with stormtroopers? Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.